All right. If you all don't mind, go ahead and make yourself comfy. Thank you so much for being here for our third academic conference symposium here at PHC. We have a great lineup of speakers. I'm really, really excited. Some great friends that I have not seen in a little while, as well as some people that I have seen more recently. But in any case, I'm really excited. To get things going, I'm going to go ahead and say a prayer for study from St. Thomas Aquinas, and then we'll jump into our first speaker. Creator of all things, true source of light and wisdom, lofty origin of all being, graciously let a ray of your brilliance penetrate into the darkness of our understanding and take from us the double darkness in which we have been born. Give us a sharp sense of understanding, a retentive memory, and the ability to grasp things correctly and fundamentally. Grant us the talent of being exact in our explanations and the ability to express ourselves with thoroughness and charm. Point out the beginning, direct the progress, and help in the completion. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. So the first speaker, I have the privilege of introducing, one, as my brother in mustache, but then two, as our first ever PhD lecture, which is super, super exciting. And it's such an honor that he was able to come and give his talk, which is a chapter from his dissertation. So Dr. Philip Bunn is a Lyceum visiting scholar at Clemson University, and in the fall will begin as an assistant professor of political science at Covenant College in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. His research has been published in Political Research Quarterly and American Political Thought, and his reviews and essays have appeared in the Review of Politics, Current, and the University Bookman, among other publications. His paper is entitled Freedom in Automata, John Stuart Mill and the Capacity for Human Genius. So please welcome Dr. Philip Bunn.
Just using the handheld. Then I don't have the benefit of having seen someone else do this, so what's my timing for just breaking for Q&A?
Oh, yes. So it'll be 30 minutes for lecture, 20 minutes for Q&A, and then 10 minutes for break.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. It's good to see some people that I know and some people that I don't. So as Justin mentioned, and thank you, by the way, Justin, for having me, and Dr. Mitchell and everyone else. This is a wonderful project. It's very cool to see this kind of academic work being done and presented by undergrads. And I'm anticipating a higher level than some normal academic conferences. So let me set up sort of the background for this project, because it is part of a bigger project, what was my dissertation, what I'm hoping to turn into a book if that happens. It's a project that sort of began when I started at PHC, and that was in Dr. Baer's modern contemporary class. You're exposed to thinkers like Werner Heisenberg and Heidegger and George Grant, and I started thinking about technology in ways that I had not before. And so when I came to graduation, I was very grumpy about things. Really have a firm direction on where I wanted to take that in terms of research at the grad level. And then in 2018, following my graduation, this little book by Patrick Deneen, Why Liberalism Failed, came out, and it made kind of a splash. Everyone was talking about it, and there was one particular chapter on technology that I found very interesting. And Deneen's argument was effectively that liberalism has within itself no limit on technology. If you want to halt the spread or proliferation of technology, or even criticize technology in many ways, you have to do it on the basis of values outside of tradition. And for that reason, liberalism embraces a sort of hurtling technological progress towards all of the bad things about technology that we all complain about. And so at the time I was reading that book, was in a class on Adam Smith, and I was reading some things in Adam Smith that felt to me very much like technology from within the liberal tradition. And so I decided to take up this project of sort of tempering my own pessimism by seeing if there were resources within the liberal tradition that critics like Deneen and others were perhaps overlooking, the sort of arguments against technology that people who considered themselves liberals or who we now consider to be liberals, the arguments that they would have And in framing the project, I picked up something that also came from that same class. Werner Heisenberg, in Physicist's Conception of Nature, quotes this parable from the Chinese philosopher sage Chuang-Tzu about a peasant who's doing laborious work, drawing water from a well, and a man writing suggests to him he use a draw well instead. And he goes through this process about what machines do to you and your work, and thus your soul or your heart, and the consequences that it has. And you can read that parable and come away thinking very extreme, very Luddite even, but suggest in this sort of project as a whole that this idea that technology can have some sort of effect on your soul is not just a radical idea, it's not just a Marxist idea, but it actually has strong roots in the liberal tradition. Whether or not the liberals have good solutions to the problems they raise is maybe a more open question, but I sort of wanted to disabuse myself and others of the notion that these criticisms weren't there and weren't being made. And so to just sort of frame the project up to this, I start off with a sort of summary overview of technological criticism, of course beginning with Plato and this famous fable of Themis and Thuth and what writing will do for recollection, but carrying through to people like Rousseau and Marx and all of heavy hitters. If you do any of this work, I had several people throughout grad school who were upset that I just wasn't Marxist, like I wasn't just going to do a Marxist criticism of technology. But then I pick up Adam Smith as a first thinker who I suggest has a critique of machines insofar as they tend to undercut or undermine the development of or the opportunities to exercise human judgment. So there's a really famous example that he gives early in Wealth of Nations. He says, look, these laws, such as what we might call occupational licensing law, one of the harms, or one of the injustices actually of these laws, is that it prevents both the worker and his potential employer from exercising their judgment. The worker does not get to submit his skills to the judgment of a potential employer, and the employer doesn't have the opportunity to judge whether that person has a proper estimation of their skills. The law has simply said, no, we don't need another blacksmith in this town, and so we're going to cut off this opportunity for you to exercise your judgment. And that sort of cutting has broader consequences than just economic ones. Smith was first a moral philosopher, and I argue that in his theory of moral sentiments you see something similar where judgment is necessary to develop this for human sympathy and the virtues. Smith ends up being a sort of soft liberal perfectionist. He says there is such a thing as virtue and the perfection of human nature, and that's what we're striving for, and there are things that tend to undercut that, certain social arrangements, political arrangements, what have you. And those problems, I think he suggests, happen mostly when not just you have a division of labor, but you have an extended division of labor that's only enabled by the proliferation of very complicated machines that locks us into a sort of narrow task where we are no longer given easy opportunities to exercise our imaginations and our judgment. He uses both of those language along both of those lines. I then move from Smith to Tocqueville, who picks up sort of where Smith left off. In the section on industry in America, Tocqueville seems to be quoting from or alluding to Adam Smith's discussion of mental mutilation, but it's really hard to find any actual explicit evidence that he read or was annoying. But I think it's obvious. In this section on industry in America, he says, well, look, we have this thing that others have reflected on, which is getting locked into certain narrow types of labor has on your character and your body potentially, but your character most importantly. And what Smith says about that is that somebody who is mentally mutilated is incapable of exercising the duties necessary of even private life, being a sort of public servant. And so Tocqueville picks this up and says, well, look, this particular pernicious effect potentially in America, where you have the development of industry that Tocqueville saw well in the Midwest and on his travels. And look, you have the potential in the industrial situation in America to develop real class distinctions where there are none. What he means by that is you have a group of people who own these factories. If a majority of people begin working in them, and this truly does mutilate their character, you have the potential to sort of ingrain differences between these two classes that will become permanent. And so Tocqueville says at the end of that section that if ever a permanent class distinction develops in America, it will come through the door of industry. But I think also this is connected to a later discussion that's a bit more commonly discussed from Tocqueville, which is where he talks about what we now sort of term soft despotism, that there's the potential in a democratic society for a despot to look far more like a schoolmaster than a tyrant, to sort of be helpfully guiding us towards the things that we think we want anyways, providing our basic needs, making important decisions for us, and we really only care about our next. And that sort of situation, I argue, is another consequence of this effective mental mutilation. So Mill, I pick up, who is in conversation with both Smith and Tocqueville. He dialogues with Tocqueville as a contemporary in letters, but he is a deep reader of Adam Smith. And he's also somebody who has particular concerns about machine informed by his own biography. So, of course, if you know anything about this rigorous program of education as a very young man, this sort of firm utilitarian education spurred on Mill and Bentham and all of these people, and has a sort of mental breakdown because of it. And if you read his autobiography, when he's talking about these things, he sort of suggests that I think he has a sort of lifelong anxiety about what that education did to him in his brain or his mind or his soul. He worries that he's been turned into an unfeeling Benthamite machine, which is the standard criticism that people levy against the kind of the previous generation that he's trying to sort of resuscitate as something more humane than the version that he got. And so he's worried about the distinction between humans and machines and how we preserve those distinctions in sort of developing industrial society. But to the background of this whole project that I should explain before I sort of launch into the explicit material in the paper is a concept of freedom as independent judgment. And so I'm picking up from a philosopher, Samuel Fleischacker, who wrote a book called A Third Concept of Liberty. And of course, most people spend any time reading about political theory are familiar with Isaiah Berlin's famous distinction between positive and negative liberty. Negative liberty, just the freedom of being left alone. Punch me, don't stop me from what I'm doing, just let me be, and that's freedom enough. Versus the sort of positive, classical Republicans that require some sort of equipment, some sort of occupation, some sort of et cetera, resources that enable you to be free rather than simply being left alone. Fleischacker suggests that in the liberal tradition there is another type of liberty that's sort of a both-and approach to both of these types of liberty that he calls independent judgment. It's a bit of a misnomer, and why in a minute. But effectively, he says that the kind of freedom that he thinks people like Adam Smith are concerned is not just a political freedom. It's not just the law, do not oppress me directly. It's not just that we get rid of these things like occupational licensing laws. It also requires the development of my human character to be fully free. Tocqueville uses this language as well, learning to be free, the schoolhouse of liberty and all this. And so Fleischacker thinks that what it means to be free for some of these thinkers is that we get to move about in social situations. We get to make choices, but our choices are based on some that he's calling a judgment. I make a judgment in a social situation what joke is appropriate. Tell the joke. And if the joke falls flat, I feel really bad, right? Or even worse, if somebody's offended by the joke, I feel even worse. So Smith describes in Theory of Moral Sentiments this process of honing our sympathy and our sympathetic judgment, that we become better, more moral and social as we learn to navigate these things. Each of these comes back to me, right? I get to be the one who makes this decision, but I'm making it in sort of socially dependent context. Thing for judgments, about judgments for Fleischacker, not algorithmic. They're not calculative. Like I can't just decide in advance what judgment is fit for any situation. This is where I side with some scholars like Ryan Hanley who treat Smith as a sort of like soft Aristotelian in some ways. It's almost virtue ethical in its approach. I get to reason what's prudent and best in this situation. Then I make a choice, and I submit that choice to the judgment of those around me. And then I get to decide whether I agree with their judgment or my own, and then I get to go back and refine my judgment. And this process is essential for human freedom. If somebody is making those judgments for me on my behalf, and then making those choices for me based on those judgments, then I'm missing some step here in what it means to be free in the way that Smith is thinking about it on a deeper level than just the political. So I argue in this chapter specifically that Mill falls in line with this. Fleischacker doesn't pick up on Mill as much, but I think Mill fits this perfectly. There's scholars recently who've written about Mill's peculiar brand of socialism. They call him a liberal socialist. Helen McCabe has suggested that his type of freedom is freedom as independence, and I argue that this is effectively the same thing that Fleischacker is on about, and so he fits into this conversation that I'm developing, that this kind of freedom is what machines potentially threaten. And so that for Mill, human beings and their happiness relates directly to what makes us different from machines. If we were just calculating machines, happiness would be meaningless. Linda M. Austin argues that any discussion of Mill and happiness entails discussion of his fear of the machine or the automatic. And so this fear of what it's like to be a machine rather than a human being animates his autobiography. He mentions when he's describing his depression before he sort of breaks out of it and becomes his new intellectual life, that I went on with my usual occupations mechanically by the mere force of habit. I had been so drilled in a sort of mental size that I could still carry it on when all the spirit had gone out of it. And so he concluded that he had been trained too hard, this is quoting from scholar Alan Ryan, of his analytical abilities and too little in the development of his emotions. His imagination had not been sufficiently stretched. And he had never been taught to understand the variety and flexibility of human nature. And the way that he comes to describe this later is he had been given of cram. His mind had been crammed with facts and logic, but it was not free and independent in the way he thought a human mind should be. And so I pick up on three major pieces of work by Mill in this paper. One is an essay called On Genius that was originally published. Anonymous response essay in the Edinburgh Review. One is a review of a book called The Claims of Labor that's just sort of intervening in the ongoing conversation about what working class, and then a particular couple of sections in On Liberty where he specifically brings up automata and these things that he's particularly about. So I want to start really quickly with the review of the claims of Smith, Tocqueville, and Mill, my three main characters in this dissertation, all spend a lot of time thinking about what life is like working class in, for Smith, slightly pre-industrial, and then for Tocqueville and Mill, industrial society. They're very concerned with, well, if the bulk of humanity is in laboring, not the intellectual art, not the sort of higher pursuits that we think of, but actually just working in whatever the majority field is, what is that going to do to them, and what are they going to like? So Smith suggests a sort of minimal system of public education for the working class. Tocqueville, in his memoirs on pauperism, suggests new financial instruments to provide mechanisms of easy, ready judgment to the working class, incentivize their saving and investing and developing financial skills and things like this. Mill suggests a variety of things ranging from economic proposals to educational proposals. And so these come kind of to the fore in this review of a book. It's by this guy, Arthur Helps. The book was called The Claims of Labor, an essay on the duties of the employers to the employed. And what the book that he is reviewing effectively argues is we're entering a new stage in production where employers need to realize that their employees, narrowly focused as they are in these factories, are fully dependent, and they need to take up that dependence as a positive mission to improve the lives of their workers. They need to take on a kind of new form of noblesse oblige and do what's right by their workers, pay them well, provide them good places to live, provide them communities, and all of this. And so he says that there's something interesting, or Mill says in response to this book, there's something interesting about the whole conversation about the working class, and that is that one of the great advances discussion of the working class and their conditions kind of paradoxically comes from Thomas Malthus's essays on the principle of population. He says that the Malthusian principle actually sparked sort of revolution in sentiments toward the working class because he thinks it suggested that the condition of the working class could be changed. And I don't really totally get what Mill is doing here, by the way. He was sort of Malthusian in a lot of his politics. He's perfectly comfortable with socially and politically normalizing things like birth control and reduced fertility rates for the poorer classes until such a time as they could be elevated. But he suggests, let me quote, that the population principle
contains within it the ground for optimism. In every moral or intellectual benefit conferred upon the mass of people, this doctrine, Malthus's population principle that we're just going to continue a population boom until people start starving to death, teaches us to see an assurance also of their physical advantage, a means of enabling them to improve their worldly circumstances, not in the vulgar way of rising in the world so often recommended to them, not by endeavoring to escape out of their class, as if to live by manual labor were a fate only endurable as a step to something else, but by raising the class itself in physical well-being and estimation. So putting aside his reading of Malthus, I think this is interesting point that he says what's necessary going forward is not to have sort of social and political dynamic that says, if you are working class, we want to help you get out of that. It's to dignify the working class, to make it so that they are treated with respect and that they're properly remunerated. And so this is 1845. Mill says, the question of improving the condition of classes now, post-Malthus, occupies a permanent place in the minds of thinking men. And so what's left is to decide how we are going to elevate the position of the working class. One theory is in this book, The Claims of Labor. This theory is that it is the proper function of wealth, and especially of the employers of labor and the owners of land, to take care of the laboring people, take care that the laboring people are well off, that they ought to always pay good wages, that they ought to withdraw their custom, their patronage, and any other desirable thing at their disposal from all employers who will not do the like, that we've got to socially and politically punish the employers who aren't treating their employees well. He says they should be tenants, they should make things luxurious, provide spacious occupations. And so, of course, that sounds nice, right? I would like it probably better if people working at McDonald's were provided lovely, luxurious houses to live in than whatever they deal with now. But Mill does not like this because he says it's actually deeply insidious. He says, anywhere in the world where happy laboring classes enjoy these wise ordinances. And his answer is, yeah, it's happening right now in the world in 1845. It's the Russian Boers and slaves in the West Indies. Those are the people who are treated the way he thinks this other author is suggesting. You're suggesting, effectively, that these people become fully dependent, in other words, enslaved on their employers, that they provide you your food, your housing, social situations, etc. And so this that his opponent is arguing for is establishing a new serfdom, perpetual paternal care, and this, he thinks, creates people who do their mental and physical works like machines, not like human beings. And so he says, instead of like a reimagined feudalism or a modified paternalist dependence, he says, not but the sole remedy of the poor condition of the working class is education. But he says this education has to be broadly conceived. It is an education that is not just in the classroom, it is the whole of your social situation. He says you are educated just by how the people above you in social standing treat you as you are in the classroom. Okay, so his response to let's have this new sort of feudal system is this is going to create dependence. On genius, where he lays this out more explicitly. This is a slightly earlier essay where he's responding to someone in the Edinburgh Review who's lamenting that there are so few opportunities left for the exercise of human genius. We've discovered so many things and we've invented so many new things that there's a risk that, well, what's left for me? I'm not an Einstein, right? So what do I do with my brain? And Mill argues in this essay that his opponent, another anonymous essayist in the Edinburgh Review, simply misunderstands what genius is and what humans are for. He says the faculty that he calls genius is the faculty of making an idea your own. Not only of apprehending it, but comprehending it and then being able to understand it and put it in your own words in some ways. And so in opposition to the mechanical way of thinking, where you learn by cram and by rote and simply spit it back out, he says a true education is going to teach you to grasp it for yourself, and that is the operation of genius. Judge man not by what he does, but he is. The sole thing which is indeed valuable in the task appointed to is the spirit in which they are done. So the difference between one worker and another might not be the labor they're doing, it's the character of the person and the spirit behind it. And so the power of the mind, the faculty of thought itself is what human genius is, and it's only left for us to develop that faculty of genius. We oppose that faculty of genius when we provide education by mere authority, where you simply repeat what an authority where you provide education by cram, or when you teach people to think like an abacus, like a complex abacus. He even, in this essay, uses the language of an algorithm to suggest that this is not how a human being ought to think. So he says, education then, in that sort of classical mode, consisted not in giving what is called knowledge, that is grinding down other men's ideas to size and administering them in the form of cram. It was a series of exercises to form the thinking faculty itself, that the mind, being active and vigorous, might go forth and know. And while I don't want to suggest too strongly that Mill has much relationship or overlap with Plato, this should echo for you the process of honing and training your mind's eye that we see in the education process in the Republic as we proceed up the divided line. But Mill says modern education is all cram. Latin cram, mathematical cram, literary cram, political cram, theological cram, and moral